gives me great pleasure to welcome to stage the President and Country Chair, as well as the General Manager of Renewable and Energy Solutions for Canada at Shell Canada, Susanna Pierce. And as Susanna joins us on stage, I want to share with you a new campaign that Shell are running in partnership with Canadian Geographic called Live Net Zero, which is an interesting way of sort of contextualising the role that individuals have to play in these future scenarios. So with Canada having set an aggressive climate target, more than 25% of the country's carbon emissions come from household energy use. So achieving the target is going to take change from all of us. So let's have a look at what Shell are doing.
10 weeks. 5 families, 1 goal, lower emissions. We've challenged 5 families from across Canada to dramatically reduce their carbon emissions and discover how we can all learn to live net zero.
All right, well, welcome Susanna as well. Can we give her a round of applause as she joins us on stage? Susanna, I might even kick off with that video. I mean, I picked up on Laszlo's comment about being in Texas last week and so the reality of not necessarily seeing too much change in consumer behaviour. Why that initiative? Why is that such an important part of the Canadian puzzle?
You know, I think it's a great question. I think for each of us, when we think about our role, whether it's corporately or personally, I think we all have to ask ourselves, how are we using energy? And how does that energy have any impact on the environment? And I think for us in Canada in particular, I think we're more aware of it today, in part because we have such strong leadership from Ottawa from the perspective of climate. And so this particular initiative, I think, really offers a challenge for these 5 families to show how either easy or difficult it is to change behaviors and to change the way they use energy. And I've always believed, and I find this with myself, that as somebody who works in the energy sector, we're much more aware of the value of energy, how difficult it is to create, to produce, to transmit, and the value of using it. And so for these families, I think it gets them right up front with their own energy footprint and the carbon footprint attached to that. And when you become more aware, then you can have a much different discussion about how do we get to those goals, you know, of net zero by 2050. So this is really about putting a challenge into families, making it very personally, and driving learnings from it.
You know, awareness really empowers choice in that way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I believe others can get involved if they're interested. So that's an exciting opportunity to learn and to see how other families are navigating that challenge. Can we double click on Canada and stay here for a moment? Laszlo obviously painted that kind of macro scenario that you're working through as a company. I wanted to ask you, when you look at those scenarios, the 4 archipelagos, what does that mean for Canada? How does Canada fit into those future scenarios?
It's great because Laszlo and I had a little bit of a discussion of where does Canada fit? And you know, Canada, we hear, and I mentioned before, I mean, I think there's a very strong position coming out of Ottawa with respect to climate. You see it in the policies they're moving forward with, you see it in their participation at COP. And at the same time, we also see a sector, in particular here in Alberta, which I'd say is very, very innovative. You know, we've looked at ways of how do we mitigate our impacts, we're looking at ways of how do we decarbonize, and there's a number of initiatives that energy companies are leading from that perspective. So I actually think we sit between both the green and the innovation archipelagos. And so that's the space that we're in. And I think when we compare ourselves, you know, in particular right now with the United States, of course, we're all talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. I think that opens up a really interesting conversation as well as to how much more we might be able to do in that innovation space to not only provide the regulations that we have out of the green archipelago, but what about the innovation space where we can actually incentivize and accelerate some of these investments that are so critical to getting to our goals?
Absolutely. Laszlo, you touched on your presentation the critical underinvestment in clean tech. Can you expand a little bit more on why that's the case and what it's going to take to change that equation from a capital standpoint?
Yes, so this underinvestment is especially burning in the emerging and developing world. So currently what we observe, and this is where I must say I've been highly critical of the sustainable finance movement, if you take the financial inflow into various ESG funds, climate funds, green funds, you name it, around 85% of that money stays in the Western world. Okay? Some very capital-rich institutions have been issuing green bonds, where you have to ask the question that does it really make a difference? Whereas all across Africa, all across developing Asia, clean energy is critically underfunded. So I think both the corporate private sector and also the finance sector will have to become much more creative in building bridges towards the emerging and developing world. And I was very proud when last fall Shell made the largest renewable investment in our history, and that's in India. So Shell is very consciously trying to act as a bridge in the global economy. We have a very strong footprint, of course, in North America and Europe, but also a very strong footprint in developing Asia and across Africa as well. But I also think that this is an area where a much more effective collaboration is needed between the corporate sector, the finance sector, and the various international development organizations.
It was kind of a subtext of, towards the end of your presentation in particular, but certainly something we talked about in advance of this presentation, the orderly transition and the importance of orderly transition. Laszlo rightly was sort of like this disruption term, we've got to be careful about it, right? And I'd love for you to expand on that. And Susanna, I'm also interested because I know you're very into what it might cost us if we move in another way. So Laszlo, do you want to start? Then Susanna, I'd love to.
Yes, and I hope you don't mind me saying that my first thought reading the title of the event of Energy Disruptors was that in my experience, most governments and most decision makers in this industry, the last thing that they would want is disruption. Okay, so there's a bit of a disruption fetish in Silicon Valley, but let's face it, if there's a new social media app which disrupts Facebook, life goes on. Yeah. I mean, if the energy system is disrupted, then the governments have to deploy the army to maintain order. This is our industry providing a basic necessity. So in my view, the objective is to implement a rapid transformation of the energy system to zero emissions without disruption. Because maintaining a high level of energy security that society got used to is a key precondition for the political and social acceptability of the transition.
So to stay there for a moment, how does that sit in tension with, a lot of the presenters who've sat on stage over the last couple of days have said, we need to be more ambitious, we need to move faster, we need step changes, we need innovation. How do we reconcile that idea that orderliness and lack of disruption are critical, and yet there's a need for innovation and transformation in the way that we're going about things?
Basically, what you need to recognize that this is an energy system. So as a general principle, anybody who comes forward with a single magic technology should be laughed out from the room. Because there will be no single magic technology solving the energy problem. This is an interconnected system which will have to have rapid innovation. No doubt about that. But very, very important to emphasize that the good old school putting steel into the ground and building already mature technologies and radical innovation into new technologies, these are not alternative strategies. You cannot choose between these two. Given that it is the cumulative carbon dioxide emissions that matter from a climate point of view, you have to throw in the kitchen sink to already mature technologies. You have to roll in the wind, you have to roll in the solar, you have to expand the electricity transmission network, you have to keep nuclear in the game, and so on. And on those areas, I don't think there is a need of fundamental radical innovation for new wind turbines. General Electric, Siemens, Vestas, they know their job. We buy their wind turbines, we build them. That's a classical corporate big business investment. But at the same time, these already mature technologies can reduce carbon dioxide emissions maybe half, two-thirds if you're really lucky. But then you hit the wall, and then you have to get some really radical innovation. And Canada is an incredibly good example for that. Because in many countries, the low-hanging fruit is the decarbonization of bulk power generation. Of course, in Canada, this was done half a century ago with hydropower and nuclear, and you inherited it from your fathers and your grandfathers. And what remains in Canada is a country where a spread-out population living in a cold climate with long distances, driving a lot, a high reliance on industry and trucking for transport. So this difficult one-third for Canada is already today.
I hear that as sort of a yes and. We need to bring existing sectors on a journey of orderly transition. At the same time, we need innovation, technology, financial innovation, which we'll touch on in a moment. Susanna, I'd love to get your thoughts, though, on the orderly transition and the journey of making that transition. What's it going to take, and what are the challenges you're facing into as a business leader in that?
Well, I think it comes right down to the fact that how much of our energy system today still is dependent on fossil fuels. And when you really think about that number, it's greater than 80%. So how are you going to take 80% of what the economy depends on today and bring it to net zero in a period of time that is very limited, or even to half the emissions in the next 9 years? That's an energy system that is embedded in almost everything that we do. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about major change of a very complex system.
Yeah.
And is it going to be disruptive? That really depends on the pace and the scale by which we can create the lower carbon alternative energies. And it doesn't mean that we're not focused on it. We're focused on it as much as we can. But in our business, one of our challenges has been the fact that while we might be able to produce lower carbon energy, for example, let's take hydrogen. If nobody's buying that hydrogen, then we're producing an energy source that nobody buys. So I'll give you an example. Many of you know that I live in Vancouver half the time. And so very often, if you drive back from the airport, you're going down Granville, and if you look to your right, you'll see a Shell station. You'll see some hydrogen pumps there. Well, I challenge anyone to drive by that station as often as I have and see a car filling up. You don't, very often. Increasingly, of course, Minister Wilkinson, you'll see him because he still drives this hydrogen car. But the challenge is that it can't just be the producers. We've got to work with the consumers too. And we have to work across the system as well, because if we produce hydrogen over here, we then got to transport it to the stations. And by the way, that hydrogen also has to be at least the same cost as what I would otherwise fill up my car with. And oh yeah, by the way, I have an internal combustion engine car that I just bought 5 years ago. It's got a lifetime of 10. Now you want me to change my car so I can, so this is the system just at a very small example level that we need to change. Now writ that large, talk about all of the sectors. That's the challenge we face.
Can I ask you, I just wanted to touch on that consumer piece. What do you think it's going to take to get that consumer shift that you're talking about there? What's required to light a fire under the demand side of things from that respect?
Well, I'd even say this Canadian Geographic is an example of putting people to the challenge, each of us to put ourselves to the challenge of what would it take to make these changes. What would it take for you to make these changes so that you change your heating system? So that you look at where you buy your energy. Like, these are the questions we need to ask. Then we become much more aware of the complexity. Then we can have different conversations with policymakers as well. One of the other things I think, to some degree, many people get very uncomfortable with, but I think we have to get more comfortable with, is the degree of government participation in the transition, and that's not just from a regulatory policy perspective, that's also from the incentives perspective. And that, again, is the Inflation Reduction Act. Because for a private company, let's say Shell, you put money into our company as an investment, do you want us not to return that dollar, but to return 50 cents? No, I think you probably want us to return that dollar and $1.25. But if we put money into ventures that don't make money, then we're losing your money. So as a private company, we need to make investments that will return money to our investors, but then also generate profits that we can put into these alternative energy systems. So there's this important relationship here where governments can help us cross over that gap between uninvestable projects, projects that don't make any return, and projects that can over time through good regulatory policy and fiscal incentives. That doesn't mean they last forever, but they last enough such that we can build at pace and at scale to transition the system. So that's what we're talking about, and again, this is a very small example, but that has to go across all of the energy system, all of the emissions, so that we can bring them down to the level where we get to our climate goals. That's a complexity.
Go for it, Laszlo.
Yeah. So no, it's a very interesting debate. What is the exact role and what is the exact responsibility of a large company? And I think the way to define it is basically providing the consumer choice. So essentially, having a Shell charger system which enables you to drive your electric car from Vancouver to Montreal, going from Shell charger to Shell charger. I mean, that's our responsibility, and Susanna will make it happen. Having a wind and solar and other renewables portfolio which dispatches zero carbon electricity from those chargers, that's also our responsibility. And these are the things for which a large company should be prepared to be held accountable for. Now, at the same time, if there is a Shell station which has an electric car charger and a gasoline pump, and the consumer shows up with an internal combustion engine car and wants to buy gasoline, I don't think it's our responsibility to send that person away and tell them that, no, we refuse to serve you. So that would go beyond a private company's responsibility. And also on the technology space, we have to reflect on, again, what are the gaps where certain things would be very difficult to do technologically today. But we also have to ask the question, do we have capabilities which we can leverage to plug this gap? And sometimes we honestly say no. So for example, better machine learning algorithms for predicting wind and solar is crucially important. But I think probably there are people in the audience who are better than that, and we will be happy to work with them. But at the same time, electrifying high-temperature processes in the chemical industry, that is something where we have technological capabilities, and we have a responsibility to have proper emphasis on the technology development on that space. But it has to be partnerships with across the private sector, across society, and with governments as well.
Susanna, did you want to jump in?
No, I was just going to say, I think the other element that companies like ours have an important role to play, again, is to articulate as much as we can each piece of that value chain or supply chain, and what needs to be done so that we can work almost in synchronicity, so that the consumers are prepared to take the lower carbon fuels. We are making the investments right up front to deliver those. It can't happen disjointed. It needs to be connected. This is an energy system. And so that's, I think, the important role that we can play too, which is say, well, these are the challenges we're seeing, because we're having conversations with our customers. And I want to spend a minute on that. I see one of the questions on it.
Jump in.
Because we're having conversations with our customers, and we understand increasingly what it's going to take for them to make these transitions. As I mentioned, for industrial companies to actually shift from what they're doing today, let's say burning natural gas or diesel and then shifting to low carbon hydrogen, what will it take? We're having these conversations, so this is important information we can share with policymakers. And I would say that for a company like ours, and I don't know if Laszlo touched on it, we have made very clear and public climate commitments. And that is to reach net zero across scope 1, 2, and 3. And so we are a bit of an outlier among our peers, because many of our peers have made commitments to scope 1 and 2. So scope 1, as you would know, are the emissions that we create when we produce energy. Scope 2, the emissions we cause to be created, whether that's buying electricity, heat, or steam. Scope 3 are the emissions that our customers create by using our fuels. And so for us, when we have made a commitment to scope 3 as well, that means we have to work with our customers back. That means we have to understand their needs, their challenges, and that creates that full supply chain that I mentioned, to have that almost as much as we can synchronized transition across the value chain. That's really important. That's the scale of the challenge.
Yep. So that really takes to that question around, scope 3 accountability. You do have scope 3 accountability. I want to ask the next, well, we've got several questions tied at the top, so we'll get to as many of them as we can. The one I want to go to now is, given the mounting crises we face and disruptive technologies and policies we need, isn't an orderly transition a pipe dream only available to the wealthy? Who wants to take that one? Laszlo?
I'm more optimistic than that. So in my previous job, I had a chance to work with major emerging and developing economies. In my experience, they have a full understanding of a need for a transition, and they are embarking on a much lighter development pathway. So I already mentioned in my presentation the Indian LED lights. That's a genuine success story. That's the equivalent of around 20 million tons of coal not being burned in coal-fired power plants in India, because the Indian government has very effectively leapfrogged into LED lights. But even on electrification, 10 years ago, electrification was basically based on coal. So 10 years ago, around 400 million people got their first electricity because their government constructed a new coal-fired power plant. And this was a very painful choice between development and emissions. Now, in the past 5 years or so, there were two very, very positive phenomena unfolding. One is that overall electrification gathered momentum much more rapidly. And the second, that now electrification is, with a bit of a simplification, three roughly equal pillars: decentralized off-grid renewables in remote areas of the developing world, large-scale utility-scale renewables like hydropower, and natural gas. And it's not a pure 100% renewable electrification, but a much lighter, much less carbon-intensive electrification than ever before in history. Now, having said that, whereas there are thousands of African villages where the first electricity arrived from an off-grid solar plant, leapfrogging, in the same village, the first modern transport which they use to take their produce to the market is a Toyota pickup truck. And the first modern the first modern cooking source is an LPG canister. So in some parts of the energy system, there is already a very impressive leapfrogging unfolding. In other parts of the energy system, leapfrogging is not yet there. But I think if I combine the technologies that are now available, the way governments improve policy, it's very fashionable. It's very fashionable, the energy professionals sit down with a good bottle of wine and complain about government policy. It's a good fun. But to be fair with governments, energy policy has improved tremendously. And there is now a much stronger commitment from the private sector as well. So now, it might well be a rough ride, but the conditions for a transition are much better than it has been ever before.
Susanna, I welcome your thoughts, but I'd also love to get your response to the other top question, which is, what do you have to say to leaders in the room who see LNG, oil and gas as important parts of the energy transition?
I would say they're exactly right, in part because they are a part of the energy system that we have today. I think for us too, I think particularly in the Canadian context, each of us who are in these industries also have a role to play, as I said, to look at how do we decarbonize them. How do we continue, as I said, across the energy system of working with our customers so that the lower carbon energies, we decarbonize the oil and natural gas and LNG projects, can be a part of the solution. Because this will take time and it will take money. We know that. Carbon capture sequestration is not cheap. And so when we do these projects, there needs to be an understanding that the customers are willing to pay. And when I think about the context, let me just spend a minute on LNG, because that's certainly been a very popular conversation recently in the sector, especially with respect to the German Chancellor's visit. LNG does have a role to play, no question about it. And I think part of this is because, as Laszlo very well articulated, there is still a high dependence upon coal. And so when you consider a unit of natural gas versus a unit of coal, we know that LNG or natural gas will burn about 40 to 45% less carbon emissions. So that's important, especially as we look at the intermittency of renewables. That won't be forever, but that's certainly going to be the foreseeable future, given the dependence upon fossil fuels, as we already discussed. So there is an important role for oil and gas and LNG. Oil and gas and LNG must be a part of the decarbonized conversation because we are so much a part of the energy system. And we all have to lean in and, again, work with policymakers to describe the challenges it will take for us to decarbonize working with our customers.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you about that too. One of the things that it's even coming through in the questions today, this is an area that is so contested. There are so many different views. I mean, from a standpoint of having to make decisions, and significant decisions, long-term decisions around strategy, around capital investment in your own organisation, how do you navigate that as leaders?
Well, it's a really important conversation. Yep. It's top of mind. Do you want to kick off?
Well, that's a tough question because indeed the energy sector is facing, the term unprecedented uncertainty is a bit overused, but I think this time it's fair to say that it's unprecedented uncertainty, and also very strongly conflicting expectations. Yeah. So I can easily be, these days, in a capital where 10 o'clock in the morning I have a meeting where they ask me whether Shell can rapidly increase gas supply and tackle the geopolitical crisis, and 2 o'clock in the afternoon we should be investigated because we still produce gas and destroy the planet. So there are no clear set of expectations. Having said that, in the case of Shell, first of all, we are a private corporation. So our activity has to be economically viable, and our activity has to generate value for shareholders, and the shareholders have clear expectations. But we also set a very clear and very unambiguous target for turning this company into a zero emissions business, including Scope 3 emissions. And we do have a set of targets for the Scope 3 emissions, which will require very significant changes in the company's portfolio. In fact, Shell publishes an energy transition report every year, which is approved by the shareholders. And this year, it's a very good report, really full of interesting analysis. But the most important thing in the recent edition is what is not in it, because we dropped the sentence "in step with society" and made the transition commitment unambiguous and unconditional. Now, we're also very much aware of the divergent social expectations, so this is why we formulated powering society and also respecting nature, because we also think that executing projects in a fashion that they comply with the highest standards on local environmental impacts, biodiversity, water pollution, and so on, and also engaging local communities, minority groups, First Nations in Canada, and bringing them on board, these are not nice to have, and these are not, it's one of the questions asked whether we should prioritize equity or growth. We don't see a possible choice between these considerations. We see a good environmental and good social performance as an indispensable precondition for successful project development.
Susanna?
Yeah, so I agree with what Laszlo said. And the way I would describe it is, in as much as in the Canadian context, the country and variety of provinces we know well depend upon resource revenue from oil and gas to fund the economies of social programs, they also need those monies to help decarbonize the system. So when we think about the revenues that are generated from oil and gas, some of those revenues are actually going to decarbonization. Similar for our company. So we have to walk this very careful balance, understanding the revenues that can be generated from what we could call in time the legacy system, those revenues that can then go into the future system, the emerging energy system, the lower carbon energy system, that can then also generate returns. So we're in this very careful walk, just as the country is, of looking at how much resource revenue can I depend on to help fund decarbonization. Our company is doing the exact same thing. Now, making some of these future investments or these emerging energy investments now current commercial and investable projects is really the conversation with policymakers. What is it going to take? How do we use some of that resource revenue to increase the investability of some of these emerging energy solutions so that they're not emerging anymore? This is the conversation. This is the line we walk as a company. And this is the line the country walks as well. That's the careful balance. And so from a capital allocation perspective, those are the conversations that our company is regularly having. How quickly can we put money into these emerging energy businesses before they're at scale, before they're commercial, such that they can generate a return? It comes back to that dollar you give me. You're going to want $1.25 when I give it back to you. So what is that conversation with our investors? What is that conversation with governments?
Well, let's touch on that for a moment, because there's a question that came through earlier about, one thing to talk about energy system innovation in and of itself. Another thing is the financial and investment innovation. A question came through saying, what sort of innovation do we need to see in the way that we think about finance and the way that we look at investment structures, returns, etc. I'd be interested for your thoughts around what new potential we need to realise in that regard in order to assist with the transition in the energy system.
It's an excellent question, and this is where I feel that there is a big performance gap all across the finance sector. I think first we have to change our risk perception. Okay. So you can look at strategic planning by basically saying that, okay, I have a business as usual trajectory, and a possible energy transition is a strategic risk. Or look at from the other direction, of basically saying that the energy transition is unfolding, and the possible failure is a risk. So I think that so the first, it's almost like changing the strategic philosophy of how do you think about investments. And then you also have to both the companies and also the finance sector. We just have to get out of our comfort zone, because currently what's very often happening in the name of sustainable finance is that if a wind farm, let's say in Sweden, comes up for sale, then the valuations are insane because every financial investor wants to buy it and tick the box that I invested in clean energy. Now, Sweden actually already has a very credible net zero target, and a reasonable renewable project in Sweden has absolutely no difficulty finding capital. Which is not true in all across Africa, not true all across Latin America, not true all across developing Asia. So I think the investment conversation has to put a much higher focus on the frontiers, on the political frontiers in emerging and developing economies, and also on the technological frontiers, where you have to create some creative solutions of how do you bring venture capital into the hard-to-abate technological innovation, how to create new contractual structures, how can you identify the consumers who are prepared to be forward-leaning and pay a premium for the first generation of still unavoidably expensive zero-carbon projects, and so on.
And that piece around reframing risk really lines up with what we heard from a number of our panellists on day one, whether it was in the ESG conversation or the scaling and financing piece. I was watching you nod. Susanna, did you want to add in?
Well, I guess the only thing I would add in is I think transparency with respect to some of these investments in these new energy technologies needs to be apparent. I mean, I think in our company as well, we've recently become more transparent with the revenues that are generated in each of the new businesses so that people understand that the way that we've been looking for returns in the existing businesses may not be the expected returns in the future businesses because the models are changing. So I think that's really an important conversation to have with investors so that they understand the types of choices we're making and the trade-offs around that.
Absolutely. We've only got a minute left. I would love to just get a closing thought from both of you. This conversation was really around framing up future scenarios, and I hope you took that from two angles from an audience perspective. One around the actual future scenarios and some of the opportunities, realities, potential trajectories that Laszlo put up, but also this piece around the value of scenario planning too. I don't want to lose that in this conversation, the importance of actually challenging ourselves. I love the way that you thought about how that can enable us to rethink, re-examine, consider things differently, and therefore better prepare ourselves for what might come. Just a lot of closing thought from both of you around future scenarios. What would you love to leave our audience to go away and think about or do?
I would rather use this last 10 seconds in congratulating you, because the way I see Canada from a 10,000 kilometers distance is that it's a very interesting example of a country where there's an unusually high willingness to build coalitions and build bridges for the energy transition. That it has a very strongly climate conscious administration leading a complex federal jurisdiction, and just the fact that an event like yours is located in a place which frankly for 100 years was associated with the conventional oil and gas industry, this shows some of the advantages that Canada has. So thank you very much, and I would like to encourage you to continue.
Thank you.
Well, I think that sounds wonderful. I would just say, yeah, I think that from my perspective, one of the greatest opportunities we have in Canada is that we have an opportunity to have a really good conversation across provinces, across governments, on what it will take. And that the challenge is huge. It's huge to set out to do the things that we've committed to do on the climate file. But I do believe in the companies we have in this country. I do believe in our ability to take on difficult things. As long as we're talking to each other, as long as we're breaking down those walls and getting away from the political infighting, I think we have a really important chance. And then the final thing I will say is that I also think that Canada has a role to play on the world stage in demonstrating its leadership and how we do it. And so that would be the second component that I see, and I think that again can feed into, hopefully, future scenarios, and maybe a sketch on Canada, Laszlo.
I love it. A great opportunity, but let's not shy away from the significance of the challenge. Let's lean in with the ingenuity at hand, both domestically and internationally. Can you join me in thanking Laszlo and Susanna for a fabulous conversation? Thank you both. Thank you so much.